So the full rules for the fighty Brutalis Dreadnought are now out. It's 170 points or 200 with the multi-melters. Is it going to add up to be a strong unit for the Space Marines or not? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a full rules review for the new shiny Brutalis Dreadnought, talking about its new released rules from the Strike Force Agastus box set, a new unit for Codex Space Marines. In the video we'll talk over its datasheet and the weapons that I think about arming it with, talk about a few buffs and synergies it might be able to get with various chapters, and put it through its paces in comparison to a Redemptor Dreadnought. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. In terms of the miniature, the Brutalis Dreadnought is basically a Redemptor Dreadnought variant that's more close combat focused. It's essentially the equivalent of a Blood Angel's Furioso Dreadnought, but on a Redemptor chassis, a great big Primaris style Dreadnought that's got a reputation for slowly draining its life out of the Space Marines interred within. Appearance wise, it's kind of similar, maybe a little bit more dynamic, and some slight changes around the armor plates. But the main changes are the Wargear. You either get fists or claws for the two combat weapons. The fists get built-in bolters. There's a big twin Icarus Iron Hail heavy stubber on the top, and the whole mounted weapons are either heavy bolters or multi-melters. In general, it's been received fairly well. People like dreadnoughts, and a nice dangerous close combat version of one usually wins some points as well. For its rules, it's got a new datasheet in the box set for Strike Force Agastus. It is an elite's choice for Codex Space Marines as predicted, and there is quite a big difference between arming it with the heavy bolters or the multi-melters. It's 170 points for the heavy bolters, or 200 points if you take the melter weapons. It is a core unit with the vehicle and dreadnought keywords, much like the Redemptor Dreadnought. It's usually just a little bit interesting to have the core keyword on big scary units like this. Often big buffs from characters and things might be very efficient on units like this. Statline wise, it's a little bit faster than the Redemptor at 10-inch movement, otherwise it's fairly similar though. It's got strength and toughness of 7, hits on 3s, has 13 wounds with Duty Eternal for -1 damage, so it's quite resilient to damage 2 weapons, and in combat it gets 1 extra attack compared with the Redemptor, probably due to having 2 melee weapons, and it also gets Shock Assault as well from Angels of Death, so usually it will be hitting with 6 attacks in the first round of combat. For its combat weapons, both the choices are free. You either get the Brutalis Fists or the Brutalis Talons. The trade-off between these is that the Brutalis Talons are just flat better in combat, but the Brutalis Fist comes in with those built-in bolters. The fists are basically the same profile as the Redemptor Fist, strength 14, AP -3, and damage D3 +3. Still a bit better than the Redemptor, as you get 6 attacks rather than 5. And these ones come in with built-in twin bolt rifles, 30 inches, rapid fire 2, strength 4, AP -1, and damage 1. Perhaps a little bit less general purpose than the auto bolt rifles that this was originally rumoured to have. You're going to be getting around about 4 to 8 shots out of these bonus guns, as opposed to the 12 shots that the auto bolt rifles would have had. The Talons do have a few very nice upgrades. They keep that very massive strength ×2 and damage D3 +3, but they gain AP -4, which is pretty handy against anything that's in power armor or better. Plus, kind of similar to Lightning Claws, they reroll all wound rolls as well. Pretty crazy when you're usually already going to be wounding on a 3 or a 2. Realistically, it just means that this guy wounds the vast majority of the time, and it's quite nice for countering things like transhuman physiology rules. On top of that, it also gets a bonus against hordes as well. Instead of using that profile, you can elect to make a sweep attack at strength 7, AP -3, and damage 1, but you get double attacks there, so a big 12 attacks at that profile. Basically, the Talons are guaranteed to be very bad news for just about any unit facing them. Very scary stuff indeed. For ranged attacks, you then either get 2 heavy bolters, they come on the 170 point profile, or 2 multi-melters, which is going to increase your cost up to 200. We'll talk about those later. The multi-melters are far more scary than the heavy bolters, but that is a heavy price to pay. Finally, for the top gun, you do get a flurry of anti-infantry shots with those twin Icarus stubbers, 36 inches, heavy 8, strength 4, AP -1, and damage 1, with a slightly pointless +1 to hit aircraft that it's still not very efficient against. It's quite a nice gun with a long range, should be helpful to whittle down a few light infantry if you can see them. Overall, really quite an interesting dreadnought profile, pretty fast, very destructive in melee, and some interesting options for different flavours of ranged combat if you want them. Looking at the Wargear in a little bit more detail, here's just a bit of a comparison of the Brutalis Fists versus the Talons. For this one it is just the melee, we're not including bolter damage or anything like that, and I'm assuming Shock Assault. Obviously the Talons are better just because they have flat better stats. Basically everything's at least better by the rerolls, that's to make them 16% better just in themselves, but other ones they're particularly nasty against is anything that's toughness 8 that you're not wounding on a 2+ already, anything with a good save where the AP -4 matters, and against certain 1 wound infantry it's all the way up to double damage due to that sweep mode. Basically the choice is trading out this melee damage output for 4 to 8 bolter shots depending on how much range you have. I'd say my gut feeling would be that it's probably more worth having the extra melee damage over those bolter shots. They'd help out a bit versus light infantry, but you can already threaten them at least fairly well with the Icarus guns. I feel like it's probably just better to just double down on being an absolute melee murder machine. Out of these damage profiles, perhaps the Talons are particularly impressive against things like toughness 7 and 8 vehicles. With the 6 attacks, they average around about 19 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, so should kill most standard ones, and even do almost 10 wounds to a big hard target like a toughness 8 vehicle with a 5+ invul and -1 damage. That's really quite good considering the damage barriers. Otherwise, the other major choice is melters versus heavy bolters on the whole. I think before we knew the points cost of these, I was fully prepared to be on Team Melter here. In 9th edition, I feel like Games Workshop was often undercosted melters a bit compared with other options like heavy bolters, but I'm not sure that's the case here. The melter weapons are hugely more dangerous, but if you're paying for an extra 30 points over the heavy bolters over them, I feel like it gets a lot closer. I'd personally say that they've probably got the balance about right there. I feel like some people will take them up on the massive shooting damage on their already very fighty Dreadnought. You are going to be having a unit that's going forward aggressively and likely getting those guns into a good spot. But then I think you'll be getting people who just want to keep it a bit more focused on being an actual combat machine rather than trying to make it equally good at shooting and melee. 170 points gives you a lot more durability per cost, and it's not like the heavy bolters do nothing as well, particularly for chapters that want to sit in Devastator Doctrine, so they're AP2. Overall, I could quite happily either take or leave the melter upgrade. I feel like certain chapters will nudge you one way or the other. Say Salamanders, you'll almost certainly want to take the melter guns, where with armies like Imperial Fists, probably the heavy bolters are the way to go. Moving on, let's talk about buffs and synergies for the Brutalis Dreadnought and how practical they might be. First up, you can get combat doctrines. I think it'd enjoy Devastator Doctrine on the low AP heavy weapons, particularly heavy bolters if you've got them, and the Icarus Stubber, the more like being AP2. Assault Doctrine isn't terrible if you've got a unique one like Space Wolves or something. I feel like the AP actually isn't going to be that meaningful most of the time though, particularly if you're taking the Talons that already have AP4. Dreadnoughts generally tend to do quite well with character buffs. They're big core units that can easily get in auras and things, though I'd perhaps say the Brutalis is maybe just a tiny bit less amenable to this compared with, say, the Redemptor Dreadnought. It moves a bit faster, so might be outpacing the characters a bit, plus it's maybe just a little bit harder to coordinate character buffs on melee Dreadnoughts perhaps, particularly when they're trying to charge a slightly further away foe and likely moving out of buff range. Still though, I could easily see you replacing, say, a Redemptor in the front ranks of a little Dreadnought castle. Perhaps some of the most interesting options could be a Tech Marine for the +1 to hit and healing, maybe even the Master of the Forge Warlord trait that buffs their combat slightly. Perhaps a Librarian for a 5+ invul save with Psychic Barrier, that would be a really quite nice defensive boost. Or just the standard Captains and Chaplains for rerolls or damage boosts like +1 to hit. You can kind of double down on the rerolls with their Wisdom of the Ancient stratagem, so if you already had the Captain rerolls of 1 to hit, then you could flex into the Lieutenant rerolls of 1 as well for 1 CP. Otherwise, they maybe don't have an enormous amount of stratagem support within core Codex Space Marines. Wisdom of the Ancients is pretty good value if you can have it affect multiple units. You can get a 5+ save against mortal wounds for 1 command point as well, and perhaps a 1 command point to reroll a failed charge might be the single highest value on a Brutalis Dreadnought. You're going to be either taking or leaving a crazy amount of damage if you fail one. Overall, I feel like you could justify a character or two if they're supporting multiple Dreadnoughts, maybe even a Brutalis plus a Redemptor or two. Otherwise, a few of the chapters are kind of relevant for Brutalis Dreadnoughts. They are a core unit with a decent amount of range and melee damage, so just about every chapter has got at least something that helps them out. For the melee chapters, I feel like maybe the Space Wolves and the Black Templars might be particularly stand out. Space Wolves get the +1 to hit in the first round of combat. They've got a rather nice Assault Doctrine for the exploding 6s to hit, and also as a core unit they can have a really big heroic intervention threat range as well. You can't safely park anything within 6 inches of this Dreadnought unless you want it to be chopping you up in combat. The Black Templars have got plenty of melee buffs of their own, but I think that the 5+ invul save that they can get across the entire army is particularly nice for this one. It makes it into a much tougher unit against anything AP-3 and better, which is going to be the majority of anti-tank weapons. I'd say Blood Angels are okay despite it hailing as a Furioso. I feel like with the enormous strength that both of the melee weapons get though, the +1 to wound is kind of wasted a lot of the time. You're often already going to be wounding on 2s. +1 to charge doesn't hurt though, and the combat doctrine's alright, but maybe doesn't get quite as much out of it as say the Space Wolves do in terms of raw numbers. I guess the White Scars could advance and charge as well if needed. That would be a bit of a trade-off with firing the guns though, unless you spend command points on it. Otherwise, for the shooting focused ones, Salamanders will like their multi-melters. I'd probably take those if you're running Salamanders. Imperial Fists will like their bolters. Maybe a little bit more temptation to take those Brutalis Fists as well with them. Exploding Sixes make the extra bit of anti-horde firepower a bit more tempting. Iron Hands I think are just about always worth mentioning with vehicle synergies. Lots of buffs that can help them out, including some rather nice psychic powers to make the units tougher. You can get rerolls on all your heavy weapons from their permanent Devastator doctrine. And if you do keep the core chapter tactic as well, you get a 6+ feel no pain and degrading slower, both of which are good things. Deathwatch do quite well with Dreadnought castles as well. They've got a few fairly helpful options in character buffs and warlord traits and relics and things. I feel like perhaps the best though might be the Dominus Aegis for the 5+ invul save with their relic Storm Shield. Next up, I must admit I was kind of interested to weigh up this guy against the Redemptor Dreadnought. As it basically is a different Redemptor Dreadnought variant, it's always going to get compared against this one I think, but it is quite a good competitive comparison within Codex Space Marines as well, as Redemptor Dreadnoughts are just pretty efficient full stop. Since the Ark's own points changes, a Redemptor Dreadnought's 185 points including all its upgrades. Perhaps the most typical loadout might be a Macroplasma Incinerator, Icarus Rocket Pod, Storm Bolters, and an Onslaught Gatling Cannon with its Redemptor Fist. Here's just a bit of maths as to the range damage output of Redemptor Dreadnoughts versus the Brutalis. These are taken at just within 24-inch range, so the Redemptor doesn't get to fire the extra shots on its Storm Bolters, but the multi-melter version doesn't get the extra melter range damage that it would get if it was super close. Perhaps as expected, as the more mixed role Dreadnought, the Redemptor does win this fairly heavily. Decently more efficient against infantry with those Storm Bolters and Gatling shots. Very solid against medium infantry with all that big plasma energy. The multi-melter one does just sneak ahead against toughness 7 vehicles within 24-inch range with those melter weapons, but if you weight it per point then they're kind of even. Obviously it varies massively target to target, but I'd say the Redemptor Dreadnought maybe averages out at around about 30% more efficient against the majority of threats you might face. It is just a bit more efficient at the ranged game overall. That is only half the story though, as there's durability and melee damage too. Durability wise, it entirely depends on whether or not you give the Brutalis the multi-melters. If you don't, then it's a little bit tougher per point, as it's got the same defensive profile but costs less. If you do, then it's the other way around, and you're basically getting to kill more points of vehicle for the same defensive profile. In general, if you're paying the premium for the Brutalis to kind of keep up with the Redemptor Dreadnought on the shooting game, it is going to wind up being easier to remove for the point as a result. When it comes to melee damage though, the Brutalis really does win out quite big. Taking the Talons gets you an extra attack and rerolling wounds plus AP if it matters. It's almost always going to be at least an extra 40% damage increase there, and against some targets it's going to be far higher, things like toughness 8 units where the rerolls matter more, 3+ saves where the AP matters more, and 1 wound infantry where you get to use that sweep mode. If we're weighing up melee damage numbers of course, then the Brutalis version without the multi-melters is going to be more efficient, as it costs a fair bit less. But also bear in mind for combat that the Brutalis is a little bit faster as well. It is going to be able to catch things a little bit more reliably. Overall, putting everything together, the Brutalis Dreadnought is decently behind in the firing game if it just takes the heavy bolters. If you take the multi-melters though, then it keeps up fairly well against tanks, though it's still a bit behind the Redemptor overall. The Redemptor is either more or less durable depending on what Brutalis version you go for, and the Brutalis is significantly more threatening in melee, around about an extra 50% more damage on average perhaps. When you put that all together, it does seem, at least on paper, that the Brutalis and the Redemptor seem at least fairly well balanced. The Brutalis maybe does gain a little bit more damage than the Redemptor does with regards to melee versus shooting, but shooting is quite a lot more reliable to deliver on your targets and doesn't mean that you need to brave Overwatch and get super exposed to enemy counterattacks. Overall, it seems fairly solid, and I feel like as the Redemptor is generally considered a reasonable Space Marine unit, the Brutalis Dreadnought is likely to at least be usable as well. Rounding it out then, here's just a few pros and cons of using a Brutalis Dreadnought in a Space Marine army. The big wins are that it's got massive melee that's efficient against most targets, really quite fast with a 10-inch move, and it's got okay toughness and shooting, though maybe not super outstanding on both of those fronts. As for downsides, maybe the biggest disadvantages are that it's ground-based and mainly melee, which means that it could be screened behind chaff infantry, which could be a bit problematic. It also doesn't get on amazingly well with terrain like ruins, either having to make the decision to hide behind them and stop being shot, but then usually that 10-inch movement isn't going to be enough to circumnavigate the ruin and then also make a charge on something else. A lack of invul like the Redemptor does mean that some weapons kill it super easily unless you can get a buff from it from somewhere else like Black Templars. There's a bit of a hard choice between upgrading to pricey multi-melters that kind of ruin your toughness per point, but otherwise it doesn't have much range threat. And then when you are moving up the board, I feel like sometimes there's going to be a slightly painful choice between either advancing and getting even closer, or firing off all the guns which do have a significant amount of damage. It can normally only do one but not both, and while the option is nice, it does mean that you're going to be missing out on something. Finally, it's maybe just not all that easy to buff with characters being a bit faster and a bit more melee focused and going to be charging out of buff range, though it's maybe not undoable with units that give you a buff before you move, things like Chapter Masters or Tech Marine +1 to hit. Overall, as a unit, I'm sure people will be putting it on the table. I feel like it's a unit that Games Workshop has balanced relatively well against the current Space Marine range, a different flavour of combat dreadnought with some really quite spectacular melee damage, but they do have their downsides compared with the Redemptor. So anyway, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. How impressed are you with the Brutalis Dreadnought now we know its full stats? And would you be tempted to take it with the multi-melters or the heavy bolters now we know their cost? If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see the equivalent version of this for the Desolation Squad from Strike Force Agastus, then feel free to check out the link down in the video description below. It's a similar kind of analysis for the new Primaris Marines with their Ignore's line of sight guns. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page as well, and you can find that one linked in the video description below if you'd like to help keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.